We are back on Taking Care of Business on Current Radio, News Talk, 1180, 1230 KGEO, 1410 KERI, now in Albuquerque, New Mexico on 1000 KKIM, and now 3 times on the Internet in the San Francisco Bay Area on knookmedia.com. Our guest by phone, David Stockman, former budget director for Ronald Reagan, who wrote a great book called The Great Deformation. David, let me take you off track for a second. Something I wanted to mention was I want to talk a little bit about, and I loved how you put it, crony capitalism, the sleaze.
Right.
You were talking about 3 institutions we all know, GE Capital, GMAC, and CIT, and their faulty profits. I mean, it's amazing when you look at these guys. You know, GMAC was a train wreck looking for a place to happen. And GE could have solved their problem if they just would have sold, 7 or 8%?
Yeah, I mean, tiny percentages of their stock could have been issued on a dilutive basis, but that's what shareholders risk when they own equity shares. Managements can make mistakes. The world can change. A company can get in trouble. GE should not have gone knocking on the door at the Treasury Department and demanding of Secretary Paulson, which is exactly what they did, that the commercial paper market be bailed out so that this massive $600 billion entity called GE Capital could fund itself with cheap overnight paper guaranteed by the federal government. Instead, as the commercial paper market went into dislocation because of the crisis, and it should have, it was way, overdone. They should have been forced to issue bonds that would have reduced their earnings, or issue stock that would have diluted their current shareholders, but they would have raised tens of billions that way. Small fraction of their massive balance sheet could have used that cash to pay down a lot of this commercial paper that wouldn't roll. Now, that's one example, and it's a powerful one, because at the time, GE was one of the few AAA companies left in America. And the impression got out that things were so bad that even GE Capital needed the AAA credit, the blue chip of 100 years, needed to be bailed out by the Treasury Department and the Fed. Nonsense. It was just a crony capitalist raid on the Treasury and the central banking branch of the government. And the same is true with GMAC. Again, they had, a balance sheet of tens of billions of some pretty shaky, auto loans that they were funding in the so-called asset-backed commercial paper market. They then obviously ran into a firestorm when Wall Street began to melt down. But the point is, GMAC was insolvent at the time, was foolishly funding a huge balance sheet of questionable, illiquid credits with hot money. And it should have been bankrupted because there was plenty of banks in America that were capable of making auto loans. There was no danger that if the so-called asset-backed commercial paper market went through a drastic shrinkage, which it has, it was $2 trillion then, and it's maybe $600 or $700 billion today, that there would have been some failure of Main Street consumers who had good credit to get a car loan or even to swipe their credit card, because a lot of that credit card receivables outstanding are financed in that market as well.
Yeah.
So you can go through these one at a time, and you can demonstrate that none of these bailouts were necessary. It was all done for the convenience of Wall Street so that people that had balance sheets that were coming unwound wouldn't have to face the facts of capitalism, which is sooner or later, if you make huge mistakes, you gamble too much, you leverage too much, you may end up in the bankruptcy court. That's what it was all about, saving the hide of the managers and equity holders of these big institutions.
Yeah, I totally agree. We're having a conversation with David Stockman, former budget director for Ronald Reagan. One thing you mentioned, David, in the book that I totally agree with, and again, I highly recommend this book, The Great Deformation, David A. Stockman. 700 pages, it's a biggie, and I've been listening to it on tape, and it's fascinating. One comment you made is that the rules of the free market were suspended, and, it's like we have a tendency in a lot of things in our government the last couple of years where we walk away from the very person who got us to the dance. Here we have the free market that's worked so well for us in our country, and we've walked away from it when it comes to the monetary system.
Yes, and it's the monetary system especially. I mean, I think the real elephant in the room is a rogue central bank that over the last few decades, beginning especially with Greenspan, has become a monetary central planning agency that has arrogated to itself the power to essentially micromanage every aspect of the financial system, peg interest rates for the overnight or in the 2-year and the 5-year and the 30-year duration, manipulate the yield curve, put a so-called Greenspan or Bernanke put under the stock market, encourage people to get out of savings accounts where they earn nothing because the rate is pegged practically at zero, and force them, into high-risk junk bond funds or highly, volatile stocks, all because they think by that procedure, that mechanism, they can cause the economy to grow and living standards to rise and wealth to expand. That is complete nonsense. It's the doctrine of the Fed. It's embraced, unfortunately, by most of both parties today in Washington. These people who are running the Fed today have been appointed both by Obama and the Bush administration before. Greenspan was obviously Reagan's appointee, and he's the worst Fed chairman we ever had until we got Bernanke, and he'll soon be exceeded by an out-and-out Keynesian Janet Yellen, who's now taken over. So that is a huge problem, but it has then spread the idea that if the Fed is taking care of everything and we have a monetary Politburo, in the Eccles building where it's based in Washington, that Washington joins in and takes care of everything else. In other words, we don't have a free market. We don't have a free society anymore. We have a giant government and activist, hyper-activist state that is intervening in everything, and both parties participate. Republicans have got their hobby horses. The Democrats have their way of doing it, but it's all the same thing, and that is unless Washington superintends, intervenes, and manages somehow, our capitalist economy is going to roll over and collapse. None of that's true, but that's the predicate that drives so much of this busybody meddling and intervention that you get out of Washington today.
Insane. David, we've got a little bit over a minute left, and I would love to have you come back.
Okay, all right. We can do that. There's a lot to talk about.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot to talk about. And especially, we tape this on Wednesday, even though we air over the weekend in most places.
Okay.
This morning, Obama's released his budget, and, just a cursory look at it, it's like, these guys don't learn. They have not learned yet. It's there's so much pork in it, and it's going to increase the deficit even further. It's like, these guys just don't get it.
Exactly. It's pushing $4 trillion of spending. It's based on totally phony economics, rosy scenario, and I know about that
Yeah.
from the early 80s. It's, the underlying economic assumptions which drive the 10-year outlook, which he says is getting better, or the White House says is getting better, is nothing more than a Keynesian hockey stick that assumes the business cycle has been abolished forever, that we get to full employment in a year or two, that the economy grows at 3 or 4% a year indefinitely. None of that has remotely happened in the last decade or so, nor will it happen in the future.
Yeah.
If you put realistic economic assumptions under that budget, you're adding 10, 15 trillion to the national debt at minimum, and that assumes that he can pass all those taxes, which he doesn't have a snowball's chance of doing.
Exactly.
Meanwhile,
David, I got to cut us off, unfortunately. Thank you so much for the time.
There.
Okay, definitely. We'll be back in 167 hours on Taking Care of Business on Current Radio News Talk 1180.